Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I would like to talk to you a little about my rekindled love for historical fiction, as well as historical fiction in general as a genre and my experience with it, and the challenge that's going around on BookTube this year called Reading Through the Ages. So I recently finished The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower, and I absolutely loved it. But that is not what I want to discuss with you today. I actually have just done a recent review of that where I gushed plenty. You can check that out on my channel if you haven't seen it already. But I loved it so much that I still have a bit of a residual book hangover going on right now. The day I finished it, I wanted much more wonderful historical fiction like that book, and I ended up posting on Twitter and Instagram begging you guys for some more historical fiction recommendations, and I got some very good responses, but they were mostly newer UK releases that I can't seem to obtain from my library, like The Seal Woman's Gift and The Illumination of Ursula Flight and Corset, all of which I really want to read. But in order to do so, I would have to purchase them, and that just seems irresponsible when I have a whole bookshelf of unread books behind me. I did, however, obtain a NetGalley e-copy of Blackberry and Wild Rose by Sonia Velton, which is a historical fiction book all about the wife of a Huguenot silk weaver in 1768 London who rescues a prostitute from a brothel. It's also about that wife's aspirations to create art herself and her husband's disapproval of those aspirations. At least that's what it's all about so far. I'm really enjoying it, but I haven't finished it. I am still completely obsessed with historical fiction, and I am plotting out all of the historical fiction that I want to read. I am so lucky that this obsession of mine coincides with the Reading Through the Ages readathon or challenge that's going on this year. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I will link the announcement videos down below, but Victoria from Eve's Alexandria and Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, who is actually the one who gave me all of those great recommendations, by the way. Thank you, Mel. They're hosting a major historical fiction readathon or series of challenges this year with a bingo card full of categories of different places and time periods. So I've finally taken a good look at those categories, and I've culled my shelves for historical fiction. And I do want to show you the different books off of my shelves, some read, most unread, and which categories they belong to and all of that. But first, I would like to talk about some of my thoughts that came about from doing this little exercise of culling my shelves and really examining what I've got there in terms of historical fiction. Looking through the books on my shelves really got me thinking, what exactly constitutes historical fiction, and why do I like historical fiction books so much? To me, historical fiction is a work of fiction that may or may not be based on real events or people, that takes place in a different time period from the one in which it was written. So it requires research on the part of the author to recreate the time period where the story takes place. This seems straightforward enough, but then I begin to confuse myself with all these details. How long ago does the story need to have happened for the book to be considered historical fiction? Honestly, I'm not sure, and I believe that that is up to interpretation. If I wrote a book that took place in the 1980s, would that be considered historical fiction? I wasn't alive then, and I would have to do a tiny bit of research to recreate an accurate picture of the time period, especially if it took place in a country that I've never been to, but I would have to do quite a bit more research if I were to write a book that took place in the 1800s. And then there's the clarification that the vast majority of Victorian books on my shelves are not historical fiction. They are fiction, certainly, and they are historical in a sense, in the sense that they can teach a modern reader a lot about the time period in which they take place, but they aren't really part of this genre considered historical fiction because the author was a product of the time period in which he or she was writing about. So a book like Mary Barton, for example, which was inspired by the assassination of Thomas Ashton, a Manchester mill owner, in 1831, wouldn't be considered historical fiction to me because it was published in 1848, which is still around the same time period in which Gaskell was writing. And even though Mary Barton isn't considered historical fiction to me, it's such a fantastic piece of fiction that it is well worth reading, by the way. And part of me is wondering why I'm even making this distinction between historical fiction and fiction that was simply written a long time ago, because in many respects, I love both of them for similar reasons. Part of why I do love Victorian literature so much is that it does teach me about history and gives me a perspective of the past. But of course, that perspective of the past is always clouded by my modern day mentality. Part of the fun of reading older literature is recognizing biases and perspectives that are uniquely products of the author's time period, as well as assessing how much of my thoughts and interpretations exist because I'm a product of my own time period. Historical fiction is slightly different. It can teach me about a different time period, but it can only do so if it is well researched and well executed. All historical fiction is written through the lens of our own time, and to some extent it conveys the author's modern day anxieties and interpretations. Part of the fun of reading historical fiction, especially historical fiction that is based on real people or real events, is to get lost in your own world of research and to parse out what is historical fact and what is embellished or exaggerated or even omitted to make a point to the modern day reader or to make for a more convenient fictional story. When I read historical fiction, I'm constantly looking up things, whether it's a type of dress or a location or a historical figure, and that adds so much more depth to my reading and to my interpretation of the text. For example, when I read Manhattan Beach by Jennifer Egan, I looked up exactly where Manhattan Beach is in New York, and I realized that it was in Brooklyn, and I started to think about how the book took place in the same time and place as my grandparents in their youth. So I started asking my grandparents all about where they grew up in Brooklyn, and I could almost envision them as part of the story, or rather living their own stories at the same time as the one I was reading was taking place. I obviously don't have a personal connection to all historical fiction like that, but for the book I'm currently reading, Blackberry and Wild Rose, I looked up Spitalfields, London, and where it is in relation to the other areas of London that I've heard of before, and what it's known for today, which is apparently Bangladeshi immigrants, Brick Lane, and curry, among other things. I've been learning a lot about loom weaving and looking up different words that I've never heard of before, all of which seem to relate to weaving. This extra engagement adds so much more to the text for me, and it's part of why I love historical fiction so much. And then there's another layer of historical fiction which is fascinating, which is historical fiction that was written a long time ago. So that's a book like Lois the Witch or A Tale of Two Cities, which was written a long time ago but takes place even before that. I actually haven't read A Tale of Two Cities yet, but Lois the Witch was fascinating because it was about a time and a place that I've learned about before, which is basically Puritan New England, think Salem witch trials, but seen through the perspective of a Victorian author. So there were multiple layers of time imposed on that story. There was historical fact of colonial times and the Salem witch trials, plus Victorian England's perspective of that time, plus myself as a modern day reader thinking about both time periods as well as my own biases and perspectives. It is still so interesting to think about how Victorian perception of the Salem witch trials differs or remains similar to my own. But I am going on a long tangent now. When looking through the bingo card and my shelves, I noticed some trends. I noticed that on the bingo card, there are a lot of missing historical time periods, which of course is a bit of an obvious observation because there's a limited number of spaces on the bingo card, and there are also a lot of wildcard spaces that are purposely left there for us. The point of this readathon is both to encourage historical fiction reading, to make it your own, and to diversify historical fiction reading. Right away, I noticed that there was no Civil War era America, the Great Depression, or World War II from the perspective of any country on the card. So those would be some decent wild cards in case you were looking for some. I also noticed from looking on my shelves that my interests in historical fiction are sadly not very diverse at all. The majority of my historical fiction that I have, as you will soon see, either takes place in the 19th century or in England, or both. I think this is partly because I am so interested in England and the 19th century, but when I was younger, I remember reading historical fiction a lot more diversely. I recall A Single Shard by Linda Sue Park that takes place in 12th century Korea, Empress Orchid, which takes place in China in the late 19th century, and Esperanza Rising, which dealt with Mexican migrant workers in 1920s and 30s California. And then there was Bud Not Buddy, which took place in 1930s Michigan and explored jazz and the Great Depression. And there are probably other books that I can't remember right now that I read when I was younger, but my perception of what I read when I was younger seems so much more diverse than what's on my shelves right now in terms of historical fiction. I don't know if that's necessarily a terrible thing. I really do want to read all of the books on my shelves, and I'm clearly really interested in England and the 19th century right now. I don't necessarily want to read a book solely because it has a unique perspective. I want to read a book because it's a great piece of literature that I'm excited to read. I'm hoping that this Reading Through the Ages project makes me aware of terrific historical fiction books that are more diverse and that do have a bit of a different perspective. So please leave me suggestions in the comments down below if you have any such recommendations, because I want to get excited about a more diverse profile of historical fiction. And now for what you've been waiting for, or maybe you've actually missed my entire Ramble discussion and have skipped to this portion of the video. Here is all of the historical fiction from my shelves and what category it falls under, if any category, on that bingo card for the Reading Through the Ages book challenge. So the first one I have is Half of the Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and this book is borderline historical fiction or not, depending on your definition. I would have to do a little more research into Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie herself and how old she is. But it's about Biafra's struggle to establish an independent republic in southeastern Nigeria during the late 1960s. So you can see how that's kind of borderline. But it's still a book that's interesting to me on my shelves and I want to read, so I thought I'd mention it anyway. I have The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which takes place right after World War II. The Mysteries of Glass by Sue G. And this takes place in 1860s Hereford. So Victorian England, or it's actually kind of the border of England and Wales, so I don't know if you want to include it as a Welsh book, even though it's technically English. Yeah, I have Things Fall Apart, and this book takes place in Africa. I believe it takes place both in present times and before 1800s, so it could count as before 1800s Africa. I feel like a lot of historical fiction does that, where there's one narrative that takes place in present times and another narrative that is truly historical fiction. I wonder why that is. I've got this massive chunker of a book, The Luminaries, which takes place in 1866 in New Zealand. And that is an interesting perspective. Apparently there was a gold rush around then, and that's what the book is about, more or less. I'm sure it's about many other things. It's really, really thick. I have Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which takes place in 1947 India, so it's the very end of the British Raj, but maybe you want to count that as part of the British Raj category? I don't know. I have The Passion by Jeanette Winterson, which is apparently an alternative history to the Napoleonic Wars, which I didn't realize before. But I'm glad that I realize it now, because that sounds really interesting. Although, is alternative history really historical fiction? They're definitely related, but I don't know. I have Kindred, which deals with time travel. Again, time travel is the kind of idea where there's more than one narrative. There's a present-day narrative, and then there's this idea of going back in time, someone from the present day going back in time, which, if you think about it, is really like writing historical fiction. There's The Essex Serpent, which takes place in Victorian London. I believe it's 1893, so late Victorian London, but I'm really excited for this one. Possession by A.S. Byatt, which I think is also Victorian, but based on the cover, perhaps it's, I don't know, this cover suggests to me like Italy in the Renaissance time, but that's probably not correct. I really do think this one's Victorian. I have The Good People by Hannah Kent, which takes place in 1825 in Ireland. So that's before the famine, before the Victorian era officially started. So I'm not quite sure what category that goes into on the bingo board. I have Slammerkin, which is 1748 London. Mary Coyne, which is really interesting because it's based on that very famous photograph of that woman. It's actually on the front cover, but I'm used to seeing it in black and white, and it's in color. But it's basically the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. I have Perfume by Patrick Suskind, which was excellent, by the way. It is in 18th century France. I noticed that France, although European, is not on the list, really. I guess the Napoleonic Wars counts as France. I mean, it's Britain, but it's also involving France. So never mind. There's Girl with a Pearl Earring, which remains one of my favorites, and that is in 1660s Holland. So it's technically not Scandinavian, so I'm not really sure what category it is on your bingo board, but it's an excellent, excellent book, and I love how it ties in the historical fiction with the art history. The historian, which I think is another one of those dual timelines, but the historical fiction aspect of the timeline takes place in 15th century in Eastern Europe. Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, which was a great, great book. Highly, highly recommend. And this takes place in Victorian London, 1862. I have Vixen by Rosie Garland. This is probably my one and only cover buy. Both for the aesthetics of the cover and the interest that I had in the back cover, because it takes place in a time period that I have not read much about. So this takes place in 1349 Devon in the early Middle Ages. So that's the early Middle Ages checkbox on the bingo card. Tracy Chevalier's The Virgin Blue, which takes place in the 1550s. It's another dual narrative, which it's present day and the 1550s, I think in Denmark and France. I have Geraldine Brooks's March, which takes place in Civil War era New England, and it's also based on the March sisters from Little Women, so it's got that extra layer of fictionality to it that I'm really excited about. Geraldine Brooks's People of the Book, which I believe deals with, again, a dual narrative timeline, but ancient biblical time period and location, so Middle East biblical times, I believe. I have Geraldine Brooks's Year of Wonders, which is 1666 London. And last but not least, I have another Hannah Kent, Burial Rites, which takes place in Iceland in the early 19th century. I think 1829 it is. So that is all I have for you guys today. I would love to know what you think of historical fiction. I would love to hear about your personal journey with historical fiction. Are you doing the Reading Through the Ages challenge, and are you trying to do the entire bingo card? I don't think I am, based on how many England-centric books I have on my shelves. I would love to hear some recommendations from you guys as to some non-England-centric books that are out there that you'd highly recommend. Have you read any of the books that I mentioned, and what'd you think of them? I look forward to seeing you guys in another video soon. Bye!